Imagine this, friends. Let's make a bold assumption. Imagine you are standing on the ruins of an ancient civilization. The laws that once held the world together have suddenly failed. The gods, once high above, seem to have fallen silent. And the world around you is plunging into centuries of warfare and chaos. At this moment, as a member of this society, the most urgent question popping into your mind probably isn't like some Greek sunbathing by the Aegean Sea. Thinking is the essence of the world made of water or fire, or what is eternal truth? No, your question would be much more direct, much more gut-wrenching. You'd look at the scorched earth beneath your feet and ask yourself, where is the way? Where is the exit? What must we do to end this damn chaos and find that orderly world again? This is the story scenario we are about to enter. This is not a debate about abstract concepts. This is a search for survival and redemption. The famous sinologist A.C. Graham wrote a very incisive passage in the introduction to his book Disputers of the Tao. He said that the thinking of Chinese philosophers during the spring and autumn period was actually a response to the breakdown of the moral and political order of the time. This order once claimed the authority of heaven, but now it had collapsed. For these philosophers, the crucial question was not the metaphysical inquiry of Western philosophers asking what is truth, but where is the way? This is a sense of urgency in finding a path. It is a search for a road to order the state and settle one's personal life. So, what exactly is Tao? The earliest form of this Chinese character Tao can be found on bronze inscriptions from around 1000 BC. Its pictograph looks like a person walking on a small path. So the literal meaning of Tao is just path, a road for people to walk on. In its earliest usage, it was a synonym for the word Xing, which means both to walk and to do something. The Qing dynasty scholar Dao De Jing wrote in the 1700s that in the Book of Songs, which contains 300 poems, people often used the word Xing to replace Tao. Indeed, the concept of Tao is connected to many other terms. Scholar Marcel Granit wrote that words like Da meaning arrival, like Ptong meaning through, and words like Shun and Ji meaning smooth and straight, are often associated with Tao and are even interchangeable. The message conveyed here is very primal but also decisive. For the Chinese way of thinking, to be able to walk, there must be an available road. And to have or build a road is so that people can walk on it. Because of this, Tao forms part of the word for guidance, Tao. Tao Shu refers to the pathway. It shows the route a person should walk to move from one place to another. Over time, Tao acquired a less literal meaning. It began to indicate a way of life, a method of doing things or a mode of operation. This is what those ancient philosophers were truly seeking when they sought the Tao. Therefore, the term Tao is not unique to any specific school of Chinese philosophy. It is the core concern of all of them. Just as the word truth is not unique to any specific school of Western philosophy. So before we dive deep into this topic, the first thing we need to do is get rid of the conventional notions in your head about so-called Taoism, especially for Western friends. When Taoism is mentioned, many people think of Laozi's Dao De Jing and the Xunzi, and treat them as some kind of single religious scripture. But if I were to make an analogy, this is like forcibly grouping Plato and Aristotle into one philosophical school, or mixing Schopenhauer and Nietzsche together. Obviously, there are important similarities between these pairings. In these examples, the latter was indeed inspired by the former. But there are also extremely important differences. In fact, in the final chapter of the Xunzi, Under Heaven, it lists the various philosophical schools of the time. Among them, Laozi's philosophy and Xunzi's philosophy are listed as separate schools with different worldviews. And the matter is more complex than one might imagine, because the figures of Laozi and Xunzi are very likely composite characters. The texts named after them were almost certainly written by multiple authors, as the scholar Russell Kirkland has pointed out. In pre-Qin sources, there was no school of thought called Taoism at all. This naming convention is actually a product of thinkers from the Han Dynasty and later. For people living in the time of Laozi or Xunzi, they would never have used this term. Furthermore, we should not anchor this thought solely in the later religion known as Taoism, Dao Jiao, because the term Dao Jiao appeared very late. It appeared many centuries after these classics were written. Moreover, the term Dao Jiao must be understood to refer to a family of religious traditions, rather than a single, monolithic religion. This family includes a series of movements and practices. They are related, but not entirely identical. Scholar Holmes Welsh described them this way. He said they are like a series of threads woven together and then splitting apart, sometimes coming back together, or like rivers branching off and then rejoining further down. If you don't understand the historical Chinese beliefs behind them, you cannot truly understand these threads. These beliefs include views on the origins of the world and its nature, views on one's relationship to ancestors and obligations to them, beliefs about spirits and ascended masters, as well as hygienic practices, alchemy, astrology, and the search for immortality. In short, many modern people make a mistake, thinking that just by reading the Dao De Jing and the Xunzi, they can become so-called Taoists. This is as simple-minded as thinking one can become a Christian just by reading the Bible and believing its ideas. But in reality, the Laozi and the Xunzi are just a small part of the massive corpus of the Daoist canon. And Taoism as a religion involves or presumes many metaphysical perspectives not necessarily included in these texts. Perspectives that the modern Western mindset often does not possess. Therefore, the topic of this episode should be understood as exploring the concept of Tao, not the religion of Taoism. During the spring and autumn period, every school of thought used this term. It could be said that the characteristic of philosophy in this period was the search for the road from disorder back to order. A common motif shared by these thinkers is they believed there was an earlier harmony, but this harmony has now fallen into chaos. This could be a natural moral order, or a unified political state. In this state, all things were under the benevolent authority of the Son of Heaven, or simply a way of life. A way of life that set man against neither nature nor his fellow man. Just as Pythagoras, Socrates, and Heraclitus, whatever the many differences between them, all took it more or less for granted that the common person does not possess the truth. Similarly, the ancient Chinese philosophers had their own consensus. They seemed to take it for granted that mankind had lost the way, and thus strayed into a state of disharmony. As A.C. Graham notes, it was Karl Jaspers who referred to this period of Old World history from roughly 800 to 200 BC as the Axial Age. This was the age of the Hebrew prophets, the age of Zarathustra, the age of Gautama Buddha, and the birth of classical Greek, Indian, and Chinese philosophy. Across these various cultural and geographic settings, there emerged a wave of new ideas about religion, statecraft, and ethics. It was a flourishing creativity, and this creativity was always set against a backdrop of political disunity, characterized by the existence of many small competing states. In China, the Axial Age is instantiated in the Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period. The Spring and Autumn period began in 770 BC, when invasions from the steppes pushed the Zhou dynasty eastward, fracturing the central ruling authority into many political entities. This period lasted until around 481 BC, which is the start of the Warring States period. By the time of the Warring States, roughly speaking, there were 7 main polities in competition with one another. Most of the smaller states had been absorbed. Then, roughly coinciding with the end of the Axial Age defined by Jaspers, in 221 BC, the Qin dynasty was established. Power in China became highly centralized, and remained so for a long time afterward. The Spring and Autumn period was not a time of outright chaos, but a period of decentralization, characterized by gradual economic and social changes. Throughout the Axial Age, China transformed from a typical Bronze Age aristocracy into a centralized state. This new state began to operate according to the logic of meritocracy and bureaucracy. In the Western Zhou period preceding the Spring and Autumn period, the political structure was defined by hierarchies of blood. The king appointed lords from among his kin. These lords inherited lands along with various titles of nobility, indicating greater and lesser status. They employed knights or retainers, again based primarily on familial ties. So what we see is a feudal system. This system should be familiar to students of European history. In this system, there are kings, lords, knights, and serfs. Goods circulated through tribute and gift rather than trade. Cities were noble fortresses. Artisans were a hereditary caste of serfs attached to estates or courts. Battle was waged between aristocratic archers and chariots, supplemented by infantry from the common people. Wars were relatively short, and for the nobles, restrained by a code of chivalry. Even after the dissolution into competing states, the kinship ties of rulers remained important for a long time, at least in political rhetoric. The weapons and ornaments of the aristocracy were of bronze, while the rest of the people remained in the Neolithic age. However, the old noble code of ethics, in Nietzsche's terms, their master morality, began to winnow away over the generations. This didn't happen overnight. I think the best way to think about it is the pragmatic realities of the Spring and Autumn period increasingly incentivized these rival powers to abandon their previous practices of holding political authority strictly within the hands of noble families. Under the Western Zhou, these states were feudal territories under a single dynasty, bound by ties of blood. Now, when a larger state absorbed a smaller one, ties of blood provided little to no assurance of loyalty. Sometimes, the class of retainers or knights was left to seek employment under any lord who would have them. As the conflicts between these polities played out over the centuries, resulting in new consolidated states under the victorious parties, the victor increasingly chose his ministers for talent rather than birth. During this period, the Iron Age arrived in China, spurring economic growth. Trade and the manufacturing of goods became a lucrative path in life. A class of merchants emerged. Nevertheless, it was commonly understood that holding political office was the only reliable road to wealth and power. The office-holding class in Chinese society, the shi, sometimes called the class of knights, is perhaps best named in English with the term literati. The term literati came into common use in English from Latin in the 17th century to refer to the intellectual class. It is appropriate to use it here to refer to the shi, because this was a class of men of letters suitable to hold office, not because they could drive a chariot and shoot a bow, although that was their original skill, but because they could read, write, and carry out the intellectual and clerical labor required of a large bureaucracy. Therefore, many of the dilemmas posed by the philosophers of that time involved questions about holding office. We must remember that this whole thing was very new at the time. This meritocratic political structure could only be considered a kind of experiment in human social arrangements. It was by no means the norm, and probably has no true parallel outside China at this time. It was a remarkable period, where a smart and capable person, if he played his cards right, could secure worldly success for himself and his family. If the office seeker was a philosopher, perhaps he could influence the governance of one of these various states, such that the original unity could be regained. Thus, the philosophers often wondered, who is the right type of man to hold office? When is it right to accept an office? Or, is it perhaps better not to seek office and keep oneself away from public life if possible? The many schools of thought styled as the 100 Schools arrived at various and conflicting answers to these questions. Among their writings, we possess a wealth of philosophical inquiry, spurred on by the backdrop of the Axial Age and its chaos. including Confucius, Laozi, Xunzi, Mencius, Xunzi, Confucius, and many others. We could compare the Axial Age of China to that of the ancient Greeks, who also produced an abundance of artists and philosophers from their various warring city-states. Obviously, these are two very different cultures, with their own very different histories. But Jasper's framework of the Axial Age nevertheless offers a general insight. That is, there is potential for experimentation during periods of political unrest or upheaval. We might recall Nietzsche's interpretation of Greek history in light of this. Nietzsche argued that it was after the consolidation of the Greek world under the Macedonian Empire that the Greeks became more rational but less dynamic. Nietzsche calls this later iteration of Greek culture Alexandrian. There was a general decline in drama and philosophy. Even if the Greeks made up for it with more scientific texts and encyclopedias, they became a culture that commented on the ideas and works of the Hellenistic period, but offered little that was truly new. Again, to quote A.C. Graham from Disputers of the Tao, one generalization which seems to hold everywhere in the Axial Age is that the basic thoughts on which the old world civilizations have subsisted ever since originated in small competing states, and that creativity weakened with their absorption into great empires. Like Alexander's empire, the First Emperor's empire, the Mauryan in India, the Achaemenid in Iran. Here again, China is peculiar. Although as elsewhere, empire in due course disintegrates, but there is always a return to unity. About the time when the first emperor was looking for the elixir of life, China discovered the secret of the immortal empire. That is, the unkillable social organism. If ideas have any effect at all on social forces, Chinese philosophy of the Axial Age must be judged a tremendous practical success. Of course, when China finally collided with a less stable but more dynamic civilization, the disadvantages of that success are another matter. The outcome was a syncretism, first tried out in the Luxia Chuanqiu circa 240 BC, with Confucianism emerging as the dominant ingredient. From about 100 BC, one cannot explore it without being impressed by its success in integrating diverse tendencies so that they become socially cohesive. All of this is to set the stage for understanding who is the philosopher within the Chinese context. If we recall Nietzsche's essay Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, or his lectures on the pre-Platonic philosophers, perhaps his central question is, how did the type of the philosopher emerge in ancient Greece? He distinguishes this question from the question of how philosophy emerged. Nietzsche argues, when there was no existing philosophical school or institutions of philosophical learning, in order for philosophy to emerge as a discipline, there must first be a type of person for whom philosophy becomes in some way a compelling way of life. Such a person must therefore create the discipline of philosophy for himself with no prior blueprint. In the course of those lectures and in some of his unpublished notes, particularly the one entitled The Struggle Between Science and Wisdom, Nietzsche comes to an understanding of how this happened in the Greek world. If you're interested in that part, I've discussed it in past episodes. But if we were to ask Nietzsche's question in regard to Chinese philosophy, perhaps our answer would be something like, the type of the philosopher emerges in China out of the need for guidance on how to order political, social, and personal life. I am indebted to Hans-Georg Moeller for this interpretation, that the philosopher's job description is the one who is able to discover order, or find order, or create order out of chaos. With the decline of the old aristocratic assumptions about who should hold power, the rulers began to look to men of intellect and merit for this Dao Shu, or guidance. This presumption is somewhat rooted in historical memory, that there was an order that existed previously, and now it has fallen into chaos. So in seeking the way back to order, the philosopher is compelled to ask, why it is had the old order declined? What it was that made the old situation orderly in comparison to our situation? And how it is that the order can be regained? And so we must take note of the incredibly common conceit of Chinese philosophy from this period. The ideas of the philosophers are often presented as guidance for the prince or a ruler. The most important thing for ordering society is that the ruler knows the way to order. Because after all, even during this time of incipient meritocratic thinking, there is virtually nothing in the way of democratic thinking. As Graham argues, there are theoretical anarchists among the ranks of the Chinese philosophers, but no democrats. Basically, all of these schools take it for granted that the state is authoritarian. The questions therefore concern the morality of the person who is entrusted with such authoritarian power, which is the Confucian approach. Or else, how to set this power into a kind of automatic harmony, so that it doesn't need to be micromanaged, which is the legalist approach. Or how to minimize the state, diminish this authoritarian force, and leave people to their own affairs, which is the approach of Laozi. In other words, political and ethical instruction are intertwined. The political order is incredibly important in Chinese philosophy. But republican thinking, democratic thinking, those forms we are familiar with, do not exist. Their political questions are not the typically Anglo-political questions of rights, liberty, and sovereignty, but rather involve the topics that might be more familiar within the realm of classical Western politics, such as virtue, prudence, and efficacy. So, if I might risk an assertion of my own as an amateur at Chinese philosophy, I would say the search for virtue, prudence, and efficacy is one way we could put the search for the Tao into concrete terms. These attempts to articulate the Tao are attempts to articulate a way of living and acting that is right, or that is pragmatic, or that is powerful. As mentioned, the concept of Tao existed before the spring and autumn period began. Aside from the literal meaning of pathway and the extended meanings of guidance and method of doing things, there were also deep cosmological and religious senses for the term Tao. In the cosmological sense, there were those who used the term Tian Dao, way of heaven, to refer to the movement of heavenly bodies and their regularity. In other words, the way of heaven is the continual process of the sun setting in the west and rising in the east, the seasons turning in their familiar annual procession, the circling of the constellations in the night sky. These beliefs were very important to the ancient Chinese. Astrological concerns were a central part of the art of city planning. In fact, the fact that astrology played into it is not unique to China. It's relatively common in the ancient world. When planning the construction of a monument, a temple, or a palace, one has to take care to account for the cardinal directions, the positions of constellations, the way the sun passes over the site, and the site's overall astrological significance. However, perhaps what is remarkable about Chinese history is the fact that they were already planning cities at scale from the top down very early on, much earlier than the Western world, where most of our major cities just developed organically, so to speak. Of course, the Romans and others had city planning, but the scale at which the Chinese were carrying out these projects at that time is already quite impressive. Take the city of Chang'an, near modern-day Lebanon, for example. It was originally conceived, planned, and built as a directive of the centralized bureaucracy. The planners paid great care and attention to the layout of the city, not only for functional reasons, but also in regard to astrology and feng shui, also known as geomancy. There was also the religio-political sense for the term Tian Dao, which finds its origins in the Zhou dynasty. We have thousands of inscriptions from the Western Zhou that survive on bronzeware. In addition to indirect knowledge of the period we have from secondary sources. On these bronze inscriptions, we have the first references to the mandate of heaven, Tianming, and passages that caution the ruler to follow the way of heaven. In this context, I think we can understand the term non-philosophically, perhaps simply by reference to similar Western beliefs about the divine right of kings, insofar as the mandate of heaven reflects a belief that there is a literal divine agency over the world. Now the degree to which this agency is personified, or has conscious intentions in the same way we do, is interpreted differently by different Chinese thinkers. But the point is that there is some sort of moral order, or some sort of moral body that governs the world. Heaven, Tian, or God, Xunzi, decides who will rule and who will not. It was understood that the previous dynasty fell because they became morally corrupt, and that displeased heaven. Therefore, the legendary founding rulers of the Zhou dynasty believed that heaven descended its mandate to them because of their virtue. The ruler has to maintain a kind of lordly virtue in order to continue his rule. Essentially, it was the gluttony, the lack of self-discipline, the drunkenness, and so on of the previous emperors that led directly to their downfall. This was seen as an act of the divine. Obviously, there is considerable room for interpretation as to what an act of the divine means, and this will become part of the debates of Chinese philosophy. But if we look back to the very first bronze inscription we have, that uses the term we traditionally translate as China. That is on a bronze vessel named the Hizun. In this inscription, it uses the word de, virtue, for the first time, and also invokes the concept of the mandate of heaven. So, what is it that constituted the virtue of these previous rulers, the great kings of the Zhou dynasty? In some sense we might say, that in itself is the question the philosophers debated. What is it that made them virtuous? Therefore, I think we should be very careful not to comprehend retroactively what the so-called virtuous person was to the Western Jew by appealing to ideas from later periods. What we do know is that ceremony and ritual were incredibly important to that period. This was a way of honoring and celebrating the social hierarchy society was based on. It was a way of honoring ancestors. Piety, xiao, was certainly a core virtue of the monarch. The inscription on the Hizun also invokes the idea of command and obedience. The servants of the emperor are told to comprehend and dutifully carry out the emperor's commands, just as the emperor himself is guided by heaven. It is against this backdrop, with the arrival of Confucius, that we come to a new understanding of Qian Dao, and with it, a new philosophical understanding of the concept Dao itself. Confucius was born around 551 BC in the state of Lu. Tradition holds that Confucius was the first man to devote his entire life to teaching. He was from the Kong family. His English name Confucius is a transliteration of Confuzi, meaning Great Master Kong. He was from the Shi class. His family could trace its lineage to the literati of the Zhou dynasty. But by the time of Confucius' generation, his family had fallen into poverty. They might as well have been indistinguishable from the commoners. However, Confucius held a number of low offices. He eventually was given a position equivalent to a mayor, then something like a district attorney. Eventually he found his way into a political career, advising the ruling families of Lu. In time, he departed his native state and traveled across China, attempting to instruct the various rulers in his moral philosophy. He was mostly unsuccessful, and he returned home as an old man. But by this time he had thousands of followers. One of his sayings is, in education there should be no class distinctions. He said he would teach anyone something, even if they were only able to bring him the paltriest of offerings, a few strips of dried meat. He founded his own academy just as Plato did. It could be said that all of Chinese philosophy is a footnote to Confucius, in the same way that Whitehead said all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato. The main body of work attributed to him is his assorted sayings, the Luanu, usually called the Analects in English. Apparently, the state of Lu was the place where the culture of the Zhou was best preserved, particularly their music, their dances, and their ceremonies. During the 540s BC, visitors would come to Lu and make this observation. One visitor from the state of Qin went so far as to say, "The ceremony of Zhou is all in Lu." This is exactly where Confucius grew up. A core teaching of Confucius is to uphold the traditional ceremonies and music. Here Confucius sees a direct link between upholding tradition and society flourishing. Along with this, Confucius argues that we have to preserve the structure of command and obedience that was previously honored everywhere and has now fallen into disarray. This is the 5 relations which first appear in a codified form in the Analects: king and minister, father and son, husband and wife, older and younger brother, friend and friend. Chinese society is based on hierarchical relationships. Confucian morality sanctions these relationships, and Confucian ritual is in a way a celebration of them. Thus interpreters such as Graham have understood Confucius as a conservative, reacting against the current state of moral decay and political disunity, and attempting to fix this by going back to an old morality and the old culture. And indeed, Confucius himself said that he was merely a transmitter of truths that have been known for a long time. He offered nothing new. He said, "I transmit but do not create. I believe in and love the ancients." Personally though, I think we should be a bit careful, or just cautious about taking such claims literally. First, because of the social context of the period. As we've discussed, every philosopher discusses this idea that there is a current state of disorder. So what is needful is to find the way back to the old order. The second point then would be, Confucius' project, like every philosophical project, interprets the past according to his perspective. And that perspective is situated in the time and place where he is from. So he asserts a conception of virtue, and tells a narrative that it was the practice of this virtue that upheld the previous order. But all of his interpretation of what constitutes virtue, all of his ideas of what constituted that previous orderly state of society, these should be referred back to Confucius' perspective standing in the present looking back. Indeed, we can even find another section in the Analects that might complicate Confucius saying that he is merely a transmitter of the old. This is from Chapter 2, Section 12. A man who reviews the old so as to find out the new is qualified to teach others. So what is it that Confucius finds out which is new? I would argue that it is the way in which Confucius distinguishes Qian Dao, way of heaven, from Ren Dao, way of mankind. Ren can be translated as humanity. In the sense of Confucian virtue, we call it benevolence or humaneness. Ren was a relatively new virtue. And I say relatively new because the word itself doesn't even appear on the oracle bones. Those are the most ancient form of material culture in China that transmits their language. In the Western Jew period, Ren was usually understood in the simple sense of benevolence. So in the context of a king or a ruler, it meant being generous, forgiving, and just, generally caring about the welfare of the people. But Confucius has a more subtle and at the same time far-reaching understanding of the term. There are a number of passages in the Analects that articulate Confucius' focus on Ren, and flesh out what he means when he calls Renka virtue. We will consider a handful of them. This is from Chapter 6, Section 29. A man of humanity, Ren, wishing to establish his own character, also establishes the character of others, and wishing to be prominent himself, also helps others to be prominent. One might be reminded of the Socratic understanding of virtue. That virtue is not simply a matter of personal development, but it fosters virtue in others. And so one's Ren, one's humanity, is not just their personal ethos. It's driven by a concern for the human beings who are around you. This is from Chapter 17, Section 7. Zizong asked Confucius about humanity. Confucius said, "One who can practice 5 things wherever he may be is a man of humanity." Zizong asked what the 5 are. Confucius said, earnestness, liberality, truthfulness, diligence, and generosity. If one is earnest, one will not be treated with disrespect. If one is liberal, one will win the hearts of all. If one is truthful, one will be trusted. If one is diligent, one will be successful. And if one is generous, one will be able to enjoy the service of others. In this passage, the meaning of Ren has come to mean something much more than simple benevolence. It is taking on a holistic quality. This redefinition of Ren is not arbitrary. All of these qualities, earnestness, liberality, truthfulness, diligence, generosity, similar to that broad view of humanity he talked about earlier. They're not simply valuable for one's own prominence or one's own advancement in life, but for the sake of the community. In a sense, the virtue of Ren is all about benefiting humanity, not just in the way of being generous. I mean, liberality is one part of it, right? But also in these other senses. Let's look at Chapter 12, Section 23. Fan Kai asked about humanity. Confucius said, it is to love men. He asked about knowledge. Confucius said, it is to know men. I think we should also be equally cautious about making too broad of a generalization about the Confucian view of knowledge or learning based on this passage. But at least in this context, Confucius seems to tie knowledge itself to knowledge about mankind. So why would all of this be the case? In particular, why would Confucius refer us back to mankind as the object of knowledge? Is not his project for us to relearn the way of heaven? Isn't the problem that men have strayed from the way of heaven? Is that not the source of our current disarray? Why then should we be interested in the ways of men? As Wing-Sit Chan puts it, Confucius interprets heaven as a kind of moral law that operates by itself, and that this is the way according to which civilization should develop and men should behave. How then are we to make sense of his emphasis on humanity? In fact, the word Ren appears more than 100 times in the Analects. It is discussed more than any other term, including piety. One way of understanding this is that, in the work of Confucius, Ren is being elevated from a particular virtue, just one of many virtues, to a general virtue. It can now be seen as the key attribute of the superior man, Xunzi, insofar as all of his other virtues flow out of his Ren, and are a part of his Ren. By the way, the term Xunzi originally meant son of a ruler, literally a prince. That's the term Confucius uses for the ideal person, the person to be emulated. Let's look at Analects chapter 4, section 7. I have never seen one who really loves humanity or who really hates inhumanity. One who really loves humanity will not place anything above it. This reminds me to make another comparison to Western philosophy here. We might recall when Socrates says in the Republic about the knowledge of the good, which is the form of forms, and thus it is the source of all perfection, all knowledge in the world. That's the hardest thing to attain, and that it's quite possible that there's no one alive who truly possesses knowledge of the good. It is indeed possible. Confucius similarly says Ren is the highest thing, the most important virtue, the virtue of virtues. And perhaps no one really lives up to it entirely. But here, at least superficially speaking, we have this incongruity regarding which way mankind should follow. As another example, we might look to Analects chapter 3, section 4. If a man is not humane, Ren, what has he to do with ceremonies, Li? If he is not humane, what has he to do with music? So once again, Confucius can be understood as the conservative, who is attempting to restore the music and ceremonies of earlier ages. These ceremonies celebrate the old hierarchies, honor heaven and the ancestors, accord with the Tao of more pious times. But on the other side of that coin, he emphasizes that you have to first be humane. You have to first possess the virtue of Ren, in order for you to be fit to take part in the music and ceremonies. To recapitulate, Ren has become a core virtue, a general virtue. That in a way defines the virtuous man or the superior man. Without this virtue, the return to the old rituals or their preservation will not be effective. Therefore, Ren is the necessary component. Which means, one cannot simply expect to win or maintain the mandate of heaven by performing rituals while being immoral and inhumane. This is why Confucius attempts to reorient our focus to Ren, and even make some statements that could be interpreted as impious. Let's look to chapter 6, section 21. Fan Kai asked about wisdom. Confucius said, "Devote yourself earnestly to the duties due to men, and respect spiritual beings but keep them at a distance." This may be called wisdom. Fan Kai asked about humanity. Confucius said, "The man of humanity first of all considers what is difficult in the task and then thinks of success." Such a man may be called humane. Regarding the second statement, treating Ren as facing difficulties first before thinking of success, we must remember Confucius said, he has not yet encountered a single person who really loves Ren. He has met no one with sufficient strength for that. So perhaps the most difficult thing of all is to be a person of Ren. But the line that is perhaps more controversial is the first one Confucius gives, that we should respect spiritual beings but keep them at a distance. Now some interpret this as Confucius simply saying, we shouldn't become overly familiar with spiritual beings. We can't approach them in the sense of becoming informal. In the whole Confucian worldview, ritual, li, or form, is incredibly important. It's established based on differences, basically distances between things. When someone is being inappropriately informal, they're not honoring the distance that should be kept. So with the whole world of spirits, we have to keep a separation between ourselves and the spiritual out of respect for it. But I think there's also a sense here in which Confucius is saying to keep our focus, our orientation on the world of men, because he emphasizes first in his response, earnest devotion to one's duties to mankind. I think this is much more explicit in another passage in the Analects chapter 7, section 21. The master, Confucius, never discussed strange phenomena, physical exploits, disorder, or spiritual beings. So he's not really interested in anything beyond the human world. Essentially, the point is for the world to become orderly. Specifically the human world. The world that we as human beings have control over and thus responsibility for. There's another famous passage often quoted to demonstrate Confucius's primary concern with human beings above all else. This is chapter 10, section 13. A certain stable was burned down. On returning from court, Confucius asked, "Was any man hurt?" He did not ask about the horses. It's almost a comical disregard for anything other than human life. Even disregard for the animals that are presumably a part of human life. Or we could look at this passage in chapter 3, section 18. Zigong wanted to do away with the sacrificing of a lamb at the ceremony in which the beginning of each month is reported to the ancestors. Confucius said, "Zigong, you love the lamb, but I love the ceremony." So, the animal world doesn't concern Confucius, except insofar as the animals are necessary for human life, for its nourishment and ritual offerings. So too, the spiritual world should be respected and honored but kept at a distance. It doesn't really need to be discussed. Confucius is not interested in ghost stories or the supernatural. The importance of the spiritual world is primarily speaking that moral order that this world represents. In other words, the importance of the spiritual is in a way referred back to the human. So, one way to disentangle this apparent incongruity is to understand Confucius' attitude as regards the way of heaven and the spiritual as something that human beings should emulate, but without claiming an identity between heaven and mankind. The working premise of this attitude is that the way of heaven is essentially harmonious. What we wish to emulate in the way of mankind is precisely this harmony. But the distinction between the two is equally important, because of the way in which Confucius used the term heaven, in contrast to how it was understood beforehand. As Wing-Tsit Chan argues, up to the time of Confucius, the supreme power was called Di, the Lord, or Shong Di, the Lord on high, and was understood in an anthropomorphic sense. Confucius never spoke of Di. Instead, he spoke of Tian, heaven. This sense for what heaven is more of a moral order rather than something to be understood theologically. This already existed to some extent, but in the way that Confucius uses the term, he entirely depersonifies heaven. It's not so much a personal being who's making conscious, intentional decisions of when to give the mandate to a ruler and when to take it away. Confucius effectively relocates intentionality, purposiveness, and consciousness to the human realm. He never talks about life after death or the will of the gods. As such, the term with which Mencius and others identify Confucius is humanism. He's obviously not in the same category as Enlightenment-era secular humanists. That ideology comes with a series of egalitarian values that Confucius would almost certainly reject. But here we identify him as a humanist, because his instruction is purely ethical and practical, even when he recommends that we preserve the old dances and music and ceremonies. This is for a practical reason, for the ordering of society. Robin Wang in her book Yin Yang, The Way of Heaven and Earth in Chinese Thought and Culture writes, the Confucian Tao refers primarily to a human way of life centering on ethics, politics, and culture. She then cites a rather enigmatic passage in the Analects 15:29. The master said, human beings can broaden the Tao, it is not the Tao that broadens human beings. Mencius translates it this way. It is man that can make the Tao great, and not the Tao that can make man great. This is hard to translate because broadener in English works better for the term Tao, path, whereas makes great works better in English when referring to a person. So the term broaden we can understand in the sense of a pathway becoming broader. Human beings can make the right road, the road to order or harmony, broader. Thus more people are able to follow it. But the way itself doesn't act autonomously, in order to make human beings greater than they are. Again, if we remember the literal meaning of Tao as a pathway, this sentiment makes perfect sense. It's human beings that make the roads. We are responsible for their care and maintenance. Having made the way to virtue greater, broader, easier to follow, then the way may lead more men towards order. But it doesn't work the other way around. The road doesn't create itself, doesn't maintain itself, doesn't cause human beings to follow it. As such, even as Confucian morality is in so many ways a recapitulation to and reification of the traditions and pre-existing hierarchies, we must understand that a radical reinterpretation has taken place here with Confucius. This could be compared to the Socratic revaluation of values that took place in Hellenic Greece. That is, if we follow Nietzsche's interpretation of those events. As we all know, Nietzsche attacked Socrates as the bringer of a theoretical culture, which was diametrically opposed to the vital, Dionysian, life-affirming culture that preceded it. But in Nietzsche's lectures on the pre-Platonic philosophers, he said of Socrates that he was the first philosopher of life, and all schools deriving from him are first of all philosophies of life. And by this he means that Socrates was the first philosopher who attempted to produce a guide to life, whereas his predecessors were for the most part natural philosophers. They were more concerned with ontology and the natural sciences and so on. They were concerned with what is. Socrates brings forth this concern with what ought to be. Nietzsche elaborates. Socratic philosophy is absolutely practical. It is hostile to all knowledge unconnected to ethical implications. It is for everyone and popular, because it holds that virtue may be taught. Previously, simple custom and religious superstition sufficed. This is the essentially Socratic belief, that knowledge and morality can join. Now the reversal of this proposition is revolutionary in the highest degree. Everywhere luminous knowledge does not exist is bad. Here Socrates becomes the critic of his times. I think a comparison to Confucius would be more than apt. Whereas before in the Western Jew period, custom and religious superstition sufficed. Now in these disordered times it seems clear that these things were not enough. The virtue, the ren, was lacking in those who practiced those customs. Confucius holds learning and knowledge above all. But he says again, true knowledge is knowledge of mankind. And so Confucius, like Socrates, makes his teaching universal. The instruction of virtue is a matter of broad societal importance. In doing so, Confucius has employed Tao in a new and very different sense from the way it was used formerly. Ren Tao, the way of human beings, gestures towards an ideal way of acting in the world, which emulates heaven but is distinguished from it. It is not synonymous with it. And it doesn't act by itself. Ren Dao doesn't take care of itself. It's maintained by human intentions and actions. Now, let's turn our eyes to another extremely important figure. And another philosophical school that gave Dao a brand new meaning. That is Laozi and his Dao De Jing. The significance of this text in redefining the concept of Dao simply cannot be overstated. The traditional author of the Dao De Jing is Laozi, a figure that has accrued so much myth and legend around him that it is almost meaningless to try and extract a historical figure out of these stories. When the historian Sima Qian wrote Laozi's biography in the 1st century BC, he had to list out multiple conflicting accounts, because it was already uncertain which accounts were true and which were not. Often he was held to be a contemporary of Confucius, although some followers of Laozi asserted he actually preceded Confucius. According to contemporary scholarship, Laozi is almost certainly a composite character. He is a figure created in order to be attributed as the author of the Dao De Jing. In reality, the book was probably written by multiple people and assembled over many generations. My favorite story regarding who Laozi was is that Laozi was a court astrologer who perceived the decadence of his time, the general state of decline all around him. He left Chengdu and decided to depart for the west. When he reached the westernmost gate of the kingdom, he was recognized by a guard. People knew that Laozi was a very wise man, so the guard asked him to write down his teachings before his departure. Laozi obliged him and wrote the Dao De Jing. And then he left China never to be seen again. Dao De Jing means the classic of the way and its virtue. The work is split into 2 parts. One part is about the metaphysics of Dao. The other part is ethical instruction in accord with that metaphysics. The first thing we may notice is that in and of itself, to construe the term Dao into a metaphysics is already a departure from the way that Confucius used the term. Laozi has been called the first metaphysician of China for this reason. From the very first chapter of the Dao De Jing, we get this statement. The Dao that can be Daoed, followed, is not the constant Dao. So immediately we have this idea of an eternal Dao. Dao elevated into a type of ontology. There are all sorts of ways of life or Taos that are followed by the myriad living things in existence. We might speak of the Dao of the birds, or the ants, or of human beings for that matter. And there are even Taos, ways of behaving or processes, that inanimate things follow, like the water cycle, the movement of heavenly bodies and so on. For Laozi, behind it all is a oneness. One enduring Dao. One way that determines or encompasses every way or process of the myriad things. And thus it can be emulated by none of them. To speak in Heideggerian language, Laozi is describing the being of beings, not the beings themselves. So already on page 1 of the Dao De Jing, Dao is no longer the Dao that demands our utmost attention as it did with Confucius. Whatever contrasts we may draw between the worldview of Confucius and that of Laozi. And believe me, there are many such contrasts. Many astute interpreters have often asserted that this is the most significant disparity. The metaphysical stance of the Dao De Jing is fundamentally that there is a oneness to nature, a single principle through which all nature can be understood. Perhaps understood is the wrong word, because the Dao De Jing is not so much aimed at understanding but getting us to let go of the need for understanding. But that's neither here nor there. The process of processes, the way of ways, the Tao of Taos is here named the Dao, the eternal or constant Dao. And so as such, Laozi promotes what we might call naturalism against the humanism of Confucius. For Confucius, it is men who make the Dao great. But for Laozi such a statement could only concern Ren Dao, not the constant Dao of nature. When it comes to the constant Dao, precisely the opposite is true. It's only by following the Dao that man can be made great. Although again, the Dao De Jing's definition of greatness is certainly very different from that of Confucius. But it's only through that difference that I think we can understand the celebration of nonconformity within Laozi's philosophy, in contrast to the exaltation of conformity in Confucius. This is not because Laozi is a rebel who wishes to actively oppose the established values of society. Rather, the model that is repeatedly presented in the Dao De Jing is non-action, Wu Wei. You might say that if Confucius' exemplar is the virtuous and humane ruler, Laozi's counter-exemplar is not the revolutionary. The better one would be the idea of the ruler of whose existence the people are barely aware. Laozi opposes another aspect of Confucian philosophy. That is the rectification of names. Confucius holds that the names we use should accord with the actuality. Language is important because the names we give to things impose a telos on them. A name doesn't just convey a state of affairs, what is the case, but what ought to be the case. When we call someone a king, for example, there's a whole series of moral duties and character traits associated with that name, without which the mandate of heaven is revoked and the individual ceases to be a king at all. So it's of great importance that the name match the actuality. But for Laozi this is wrong-headed, because the name can never match the actuality. Again, in the first chapter we get this line: the name that can be named is not the eternal name. The nameless is the origin of heaven and earth. In other words, Laozi actually draws a separation between language and actuality. Whatever names we come up with, these can only be useful as regards particular things among the myriad things. One can never name the nameless. The eternal Tao is beyond all such designations, because all attempts to designate what it is end up limiting or constraining it in some fashion. The eternal Tao encompasses everything, and therefore cannot be constrained without imposing a limitation on it, falsifying it. To make another comparison, this kind of attitude can be seen in many Western philosophers who have written about the ineffability of the absolute or the divine, like Maimonides and his via negativa, negative theology. He expresses that without falsifying and diminishing the divine nature. We can't really assert anything positive about God, because God's attributes are all infinite. So anything we can say within our language that expresses the finite can't really capture anything of God's nature. And so we can only really proceed truthfully by saying what God is not. Meister Eckhart had a similar attitude, although more mystical in his thinking. And so, the fundamental metaphysical claims about the Tao in the Dao De Jing are that it precedes all beings, all heaven and earth. Its qualities can't be articulated, and it acts by not acting. And that last point I think is especially key. Accordingly, Jiu Lingsheng has argued that Laozi essentially articulates a view of the Tao as non-being, Wu. After all, no qualities can be assigned to it. Nothing can be said of it. We cannot even say that it exists, cannot even attribute that aspect to it. In section 40 of the Dao De Jing, we have the following lines which seem to say it outright. Reversion is the action of Tao. Weakness is the function of Tao. All things in the world come from being, and being comes from non-being. But then Laozi goes on nevertheless to describe the Tao as something rather than nothing. That's what the very encapsulation of the concept into a word effectively does. Albeit it's an elusive and evasive something that always remains indefinite or undefinable. But even if only as a grammatical convention, he is forced to refer to the Tao throughout the text as though it were a real thing, which raises its own set of questions. I think a lot of the inherent contradictions in this account for Laozi's struggle with language. So he's said that we can know nothing of the eternal Tao, yet we have a whole book describing it. We cannot assign it a name, and yet we are calling it Tao. Perhaps the best example of this sort of incongruity is in section 4, which I will read in an abridged form. Tao is empty, like a bowl. It may be used, but its capacity is never exhausted. It is bottomless, perhaps the ancestor of all things. Deep and still, it appears to exist forever. I do not know whose son it is. It seems to have existed before the Lord. The term for Lord is Xunzi, the Lord on high. James Legge went ahead in his translation and just used the term God, which I think is appropriate. But notice the paradoxical nature of this passage. Tao is like an empty bowl. It's bottomless. So images of emptiness, nothingness. And yet this means its capacity is never exhausted. It's like a bowl whose empty space is never used up. so it can always be filled. It's another motif of Laozi. By the way, emptiness as something useful. Nothing as something that can be used. That is counterintuitive. But I think it's also indisputably true if we reflect on it. Whatever linguistic trouble such a statement may pose. I mean, another metaphor is the empty space of the house in which we live, right? We think the house is the thing that's valuable. But if it didn't have the empty space inside, nothingness, it wouldn't be worth anything, right? But what else do we learn here in this passage where he describes the Tao as emptiness? Well, that the Tao appears to exist forever. It precedes the existence of God. Of course it did, because it's eternal. That's sort of contained in the definition. But if the Tao was being described as non-being, then what are we saying exists? I mean, sure, it's emptiness, but if emptiness can be used, is it really actually emptiness? Is it actually synonymous with nothingness? Is it actually a form of being, just a more subtle form of being? Is non-being really a misnomer? For my part, I think trying to nail down the position of the Dao De Jing on this question is the wrong approach. The metaphysics of Laozi, in my opinion, is not as concerned with being and non-being as with action and non-action, wei and wu wei. Because ultimately naming whether the Tao exists or not, whether it is defined by being or being non-being, is just to assign names. It's assigning categories to this undefinable process or movement. The substantive metaphysical claim that Laozi makes, in my view, is that, ontologically, preceding any action, there's a background of non-action. Just as behind whatever manifests, there's something hidden. Behind the myriad things or the 10,000 things, there is a oneness. Even to call it a oneness is somewhat unacceptable, because that would be a definite quality, right? When we say it's not many, we're limiting the Tao. When in fact it is also that, or also not that, depending on your perspective. But if we recall section 40 again, when Laozi said that the Tao acts by reversion or reversal, he's articulating one of the themes or patterns that we see throughout the text. The Tao moves from one opposite pole to the other, because the two poles imply one another and depend on one another. From this way of thinking, non-being can become fecund, and non-action can become productive. And so I think a helpful way to understand the metaphysics of Tao here in the Dao De Jing, though by no means the only way, is to view the unnamability of the Tao through this lens of opposites containing one another. Therefore non-action is the ground of action. So too then is non-being the ground of being. This statement I don't think is meant to produce a clear metaphysics. It's not meant to produce a definitive ontological formulation. However we want to put it, I think that would be to misunderstand Laozi's project, which, if I may be so bold, is to disclose or at least to gesture towards a movement or process, rather than reify the Tao into a concept. So what is that movement or process? We'll look at a few sections in the Dao De Jing where I think it becomes clear. This is 37. Tao invariably takes no action, and yet there is nothing left undone. If kings and barons can keep it, all things will transform spontaneously. Again, a contrast with the Confucians is apt. The Confucians focus on the way of men while emulating the way of heaven. Laozi advocates for emulating that which preceded heaven, which is the Tao. It's a very different Tao than the moral order the Confucians envisioned. It is a way of not acting, letting things happen naturally or spontaneously. That's the model the king should follow. Let's look at number 43. The softest things in the world overcome the hardest things in the world. Non-being penetrates that in which there is no space. Through this I know the advantage of taking no action. Few in the world can understand teaching without words and the advantage of taking no action. So the softest things in the world overcome the hardest. The best image for this is the Grand Canyon, right? Water, at least in theory, is softer than a rock. I mean, obviously, if you fall from a great height and you hit the water, that isn't true. It can be just as hard as concrete. But if you run your fingers along the surface of a stream, or even if you punch the stream, that would be a very different experience from punching a wall of rock. but nevertheless over millions of years, hundreds of millions of years. Soft flowing water cuts down and wears away solid rock. And Laozi actually uses this explicit example in 78. There is nothing softer and weaker than water. And yet there is nothing better for attacking hard and strong things. And what's more, water doesn't do this intentionally or hastily. It simply follows its natural course, we might say. Laozi often compares the Tao or the one who follows the Tao to water. When people appropriate Taoism for the purposes of self-help, sometimes they interpret that into a flow state or something like that. You know, they'll take those kinds of insights from the Dao De Jing. And I'm not going to say that there isn't something beneficial to being able to get into a flow state. And I think Laozi would certainly appreciate that parallel. Right? Of the flow being the place where you're most productive. But let's look at what the specifics are of the comparison of the Tao to water. Of what Laozi says in chapter 8. The best man is like water. Water is good, it benefits all things and does not compete with them. It dwells in lowly places that all disdain. And that is why it is so near to the Tao. So again, the really substantive metaphysical claim being made here about the Tao by comparison to water is that the nature of water has this non-striving character to it, right? In fact, it seeks the lowest level. It flows by the path of least resistance to the lowest point. And as such it ends up going to lowly places. You might think of marshes, swamps, sloughs, puddles of mud and so on. But I think there's like a general sort of analogical point being made that human beings abhor or avoid going to the lowest level. They don't want to be at the bottom of, for example, a social hierarchy. The bottom is always seen as bad. The top is good, but for water it's the opposite. But remember, the way of human beings is very different from the eternal way. Humans in general don't live in accord with the principles of the Tao as Laozi sees it. Laozi's version of the superior man or the sage is one who is essentially described in this passage as selfless, empty, of benefit to all but striving against no one else, comfortable to seek the lowest level. We might say in Nietzsche's language to go under. The practical application of the Dao De Jing, then, is a virtue ethic based on the notion that not acting is a form of acting. This is a wei wu wei. Acting without acting. Wei is action, wu wei is non-action. And that in fact, while it may appear in the short term or from a limited perspective, being active and intentional and striving in the world will produce results. From the long-term broad perspective, the weak always overcomes the strong. Non-action always overcomes action. It's actually the better bet to go with non-action. And so the really subversive claim of the Dao De Jing is that the Confucian attempt to inculcate a moral order on the world, modeled after their view of the moral order of heaven, actually harmed mankind. It's a reversal of the usual story, right? Man was vicious and inhuman, and thus needed to be morally instructed to become virtuous and humane. Laozi says, it was the introduction of virtue that created vice. It was the introduction of the idea of humanity that created inhumanity. This is from section 57. The more taboos and prohibitions there are in the world, the poorer the people will be. The more sharp weapons the people have, the more troubled the state will be. The more cunning and skill a man possesses, the more vicious things will appear. The more laws and orders are made prominent, the more thieves and robbers there will be. Therefore the sage says, I take no action and the people of themselves are transformed. I love tranquility and the people of themselves become correct. I engage in no activity and the people of themselves become prosperous. Have no desires and the people of themselves become simple. Another way to articulate the Tao of Laozi would be this. Return to simplicity. The return to the state of being an uncarved block, pu. So the whole idea of like once you have a carved block, once you have etched into it, you've turned it into a definite signifier. It would seem almost to be like a miraculous transformation to go from the state of being carved, of having been etched and shaped and molded by society, into a more simple, original, natural form. But Laozi says, that is the way, That's the Tao back to harmony. Now remember, the Dao De Jing's intended audience for its ethical instruction is, at least first and foremost, the prince. Just as with Confucius, the hope is that the ruler of a state will wish to emulate the Dao De Jing's version of a sage, and therefore loosen the reins of state to whatever degree possible. Rule with a light touch. Trust that if you allow affairs to take their natural course, good things will happen spontaneously. If you try to enforce morality, you'll create immorality. If you pass a bunch of laws, you'll create thieves and robbers. But this is the very important similarity between Laozi and Confucius yet again, that they both purport to teach the way back to a natural harmony that existed before. It's simply that they point the way in opposite directions. Laozi, just as much as Confucius, makes the claim that the ancients, the emperors and sages of old, or sage kings as they call them, they were that level of virtuous superiority. They are the model for the Tao that we ought to follow today. But whereas Confucius would say these sage emperors of ancient times were exemplars of Confucian virtue, virtue as I understand it, which is this moralizing and sort of active force of shaping human beings, the Dao De Jing says the great sage emperors followed the Tao as the eternal Tao that Laozi understands. That Confucian virtue only appears after we enter a time of corruption. See Chapter 18. When the great Tao declined, the doctrines of humanity, Ren, and righteousness, Yi, arose. When knowledge and wisdom appeared, there emerged great hypocrisy. When the 6 family relationships are not in harmony, there will be the advocacy of filial piety and deep love to children. When a country is in disorder, there will be praise of loyal ministers. But Laozi asserts that prior to that sad state of affairs, there were those rulers who understood the Tao and practiced virtue in accord with that understanding. See section 15. Of old, those who were the best rulers were subtly mysterious and profoundly penetrating, too deep to comprehend. And because they cannot be comprehended, I can only describe them arbitrarily, cautious like crossing a frozen stream in the winter, being at a loss like one fearing danger on all sides, reserved like one visiting, supple and pliant like ice about to melt, genuine like a piece of uncarved wood, open and broad like a valley, merged and undifferentiated like muddy water. So, the state of being muddy or undifferentiated. It's not normally how we describe sages and great leaders, right? Their state of mind. But this is the picture in the Dao De Jing of the best rulers of old. Cautious, at a loss. Reserved, yielding, simple like the uncarved block. Open and broad-minded like a valley. And like muddy water, merged and undifferentiated. These sages cannot be comprehended. They can only be known indirectly by analogy. They're not described as active or moralizing but hesitating and unsure. We also have this description in section 65. In ancient times, those who practiced Tao well did not seek to enlighten the people, but to make them ignorant. People are difficult to govern because they have too much knowledge. Therefore, he who runs the state through knowledge is a robber of the state. He who rules a state not through knowledge is a blessing to the state. Always to know the standard is called profound and secret virtue. Virtue becomes deep and far-reaching, and with it all things return to their original natural state. Then complete harmony will be reached. I think that's all rather clear, pointing the way back to the original harmony. But the way is not through the instruction of virtue. In fact, the text invokes secret virtue. So virtue is something that you keep to yourself or that the sage keeps to himself. He doesn't go and try and instruct everybody in it, because this attempt to enlighten people actually makes them worse. Precisely because of the fact that the Ren Tao is not the eternal Tao. Attempting to rule the state through ethical instruction is folly. And really, if we're being serious, the prospect of a state that relies on everyone in the state behaving morally is somewhat ridiculous. The very point of the laws is to enforce order on those who can't be counted on to behave morally. Now obviously Laozi has already said making too many laws is also going to create disorder in and of itself. So his point is not to rule with an iron fist. But we have to note that the legalists, a later school of thought, took inspiration from the Dao De Jing and actually enacted some of the darker possible interpretations of that passage. Like this one. Don't rely on instructing people in virtue. Make them simple, right? Keep them ignorant. That's literally the logic of this passage. That people with too much knowledge are hard to rule over. So it'll be easier to rule over people who are simple and ignorant. That could certainly have a very dark interpretation or implementation of that idea. But this is another rebuke to the Confucian conception of Tao. For Confucius, learning and knowledge are obvious societal goods that ought to be fostered. The value of learning can't be separated out from the Confucian morality, because learning is the basis of moral instruction. Laozi rejects this. And he even rejects Ren as this general virtue out of which all the others flow. This rejection can be seen in perhaps the harshest passage in the Dao De Jing. Chapter 5. Heaven and earth are not humane, Ren, they regard all things as straw dogs. The sage is not humane, he regards all people as straw dogs. Straw dogs were quite literally that. They were dog figurines made out of straw. And they were used as a substitute for a living dog in a ceremonial sacrifice. So we don't have to kill a real dog anymore. We can just make one out of straw and destroy that. So the straw dog is above all made to be destroyed. It is disposable by nature. It is treated with reverence, but it's destroyed. That's the point of why it's made. So if heaven and earth regard all things as straw dogs, all things are impermanent, then we might say, to paraphrase, nature is totally indifferent to all things within it. The same way that we are indifferent to disposable inanimate objects that we create. And so in emulation of heaven and earth, the sage, the superior man, and he's doing this simulation again not because there's a moral order there, but because he's perceiving the eternal Tao within the operation of heaven and earth. So the sage also regards all things within the human world with indifference. So he's not a man of Ren. He doesn't follow Ren Tao. The virtuous man doesn't have this humanness, this sentimentality. He has something more like equanimity. It's probably the most positive way that we can put it. So Ren is rejected as a virtue. It's not a virtue, it's another false virtue. It's a sign of degeneration at best. At worst, maybe it's even a cause of vice. And I think this is the reason for the apparently paradoxical claim in chapter 38. The superior man is not conscious of his virtue, and it is for this reason that he possesses virtue. Whereas the inferior man is conscious of his virtue, and therefore he lacks it. If we survey the many claims that have been made so far by the Laozi, we will see that it cannot be any other way. When virtue is consciously or intentionally acted, it's going to set one out of step with the Tao. When the virtue is named, it becomes effectively falsified. So if we return to the initial question of our inquiry, where is the way? Where is the Tao? The Dao De Jing's answer is that the way cannot be taught. It can't be spoken. It can't be put into a moral formula. The way that Laozi adumbrates in this text is a natural spontaneity, the unconscious ground of all conscious action. Oftentimes Westerners approach this text searching for an esoteric meaning, some spiritual insight or secret. But when we compare Laozi point by point to Confucius, we find that the logic of the text is not hidden. It doesn't have to be decoded, so to speak. We can see in the movement of thought in Chinese philosophy, we've moved from Tian Dao to Ren Dao to now this new conception, the eternal Tao of all nature. Indeed, you might say, because the word for nature and Chinese philosophy at this time is essentially the same as the word for heaven. So it precedes heaven. It precedes the movements of the heavens and the activity of all the myriad things on earth. The central claims about this new conception of Tao are all refutations of the Confucian claims. Non-action overcomes action. Weakness overcomes strength. Non-learning is better than learning. Hidden or unconscious virtue is better than conscious outward virtue. Equanimity is better than humanity. Rather than looking back for some moral tradition or a moral law written in the heavens, We should look back to the original naturalness that was the unity. That was the harmony that the ancients had. Not some grand moralizing project. Now obviously there is indeed a wealth of insights that one could draw about metaphysics from this perspective. And insights one could draw regarding spirituality and personal development. Indeed, you can use the Dao De Jing for self-help. But I think we shouldn't ignore there are social and political implications to this worldview. Arguably these are the main focus of the Dao De Jing. Because after all, if we can't really follow or even know the eternal Tao, what good is studying it? Well, perhaps the good is in the power that we gain by studying it. By coming close to or closer to an understanding of the eternal Tao. Even if we can't really know it or name it. And effectively again in substantive terms what this means is that he who acts through non-action will discover that he's more efficacious. That is actually more powerful. And that this is the prudent thing to do, the right thing to do. To act through non-action. Next, we will focus on two other important figures, Mencius and Xunzi. Both are Confucians. We have already mentioned the immense and all-pervasive influence of Confucius. So most of the philosophers who come after him are influenced by him. But these two take opposite views on human nature. And form a nice little set of antipodes. For Mencius, human nature is fundamentally and originally good. For Xunzi, human nature is fundamentally and originally evil. Now these may seem like extreme positions. I think most people today are going to respond to this by saying, the reality is that it's somewhere in the middle, right? But I don't think this debate is idle speculation. Essentially at the root of this debate is a more fundamental question. As to whether the way to order is found by following our innate nature, or by curtailing or otherwise regulating that nature. If people are fundamentally good, then it would seem counterintuitive that we would need to impose a moral schema of enumerated virtues, or enforce laws that incentivize orderly behavior. Now when it comes to what Confucius himself thought, to oversimplify somewhat, he generally seems to lean on the side that human beings are basically good. But Confucius does think that we require moral instruction. And even if holding these two views together isn't a true contradiction, even if they're not truly dichotomous, I think by implication there's sort of a bit of an ambiguity there. Because Confucius holds both positions. He believes in the basic goodness of people, and also the fact that there's a need for them to be morally instructed. That kind of creates this ambiguity to his teachings. And so it makes possible these two opposite interpretations. What is interesting is that both Mencius and Xunzi seem to take influence from Laozi as well. Let's look at Mencius first. This passage is in Book 6 of the Mencius. Laozi said, man's nature is like whirling water. If a breach in the pool is made to the east, it will flow to the east. If a breach is made to the west, it will flow to the west. Man's nature is indifferent to good and evil, just as water is indifferent to east and west. Mencius said, water indeed is indifferent to east and west. But is it indifferent to high and low? Man's nature is naturally good just as water naturally flows downward. There is no man without this good nature, neither is there water that does not flow downward. Now you can strike the water and cause it to splash upward over your forehead, and by damming water and leading it you can force it uphill. Is this the nature of water? It is the force of circumstance that makes it do so. Man can be made to do evil, for his nature can be treated in the same way. So Mencius reminds us of a leitmotif of the Dao De Jing that water always seeks the lowest level. Now that's not a unique insight to Laozi. And water is a downward moving element in contrast to fire as an upward moving element. These associations appear, for example, in the I Ching, Book of Changes. But we might be reminded of Laozi's correlation of the downward movement of water to the behavior of the Tao or the way of the sage. So just as water naturally seeks the lower, human beings naturally seek the good. Evil is accounted for as something artificial, a disruption of the basic human goodness. That would otherwise simply follow its own good nature. But this is somewhat of a strange analogy for Mencius to use. Because the whole idea of manipulating the course of water, I mean, this goes back to legends about the earliest days of Chinese history. Through you the great controlling the floods. That was one of the things that was attributed to the deeds of these early sage emperors. That was like a genius thing that they did. Isn't the Confucian moral regime comparable to sort of controlling or steering the flow of water? But of course Mencius doesn't use precisely that metaphor. He talks about, well, the first thing just sort of striking the water and causing it to splash upward. So he gives kind of an image of chaos. Right? Of interceding to create chaos in the natural flow. Or he talks about doing it, making it go uphill. We could conceive of a situation where that would be useful for an engineer. But nevertheless it seems to be the case that that's not the nature of the water. It's something that is causing the water to do, manipulating it to do. Let's look at another parable that I think helps further elucidate Mencius's point. The trees of the Nyo mountain, Ox mountain, were once beautiful. But can the mountain be regarded any longer as beautiful since, being in the borders of a big state, the trees have been hewed down with axes and hatchets? Still, with the rest given them by the days and nights and the nourishment provided them by the rains and the dew, they were not without buds and sprouts springing forth. But then the cattle and sheep pastured upon them once and again. That is why the mountain looks so bald. When people see that it is so bald, they think that there was never any timber on the mountain. Is this the true nature of the mountain? Is there not also a heart of humanity and righteousness originally existing in man? The way in which he loses his originally good mind is like the way in which the trees are hewed down with axes and hatchets. So the mountain is currently bald, treeless. But is that the true nature of the mountain? No. Just as vice and wickedness are not the true nature of human beings. We all have a natural heart of righteousness and humanity. So we could regard man's goodness as like a tree that would naturally sprout up, were it not continually hacked down or grazed away. And I think this gets us some of the way to reconciling Mencius's position. In that we may now understand why it is that people act wickedly when they're in fact basically good. Virtue and learning are required as a way of perhaps safeguarding that natural goodness. Perhaps it's a fragile thing. As such, we can regard the roots of the classical Confucian virtues as natural tendencies in man. That could be compared to these sprouts and buds. In fact, that's just the terminology that Mencius uses, sprouts, duen. That must be nurtured and protected so that they can develop along their natural good course. We could even argue that if there wasn't some natural tendency towards virtue, some natural instinct at the foundations of it, it would be impossible to get man to follow any course of moral instruction. The reason why we are receptive to such a thing is because of these sprouts, which serve as the beginnings of the virtues. Mencius elaborates in a famous passage from the second book, quoting here in abridged form. All men have the mind which cannot bear to see the suffering of others. We see that a man without the feeling of commiseration is not a man. A man without the feeling of shame and dislike is not a man. A man without the feeling of deference and compliance is not a man. And a man without the feeling of right and wrong is not a man. The feeling of commiseration is the sprout of humanity, Ren. The feeling of shame and dislike is the sprout of righteousness, Yi. The feeling of deference and compliance is the sprout of propriety, Li. And the feeling of right and wrong is the sprout of wisdom, Zhi. Men have these for sprouts just as they have their 4 limbs. This is Mencius's theory of the 4 sprouts. Having these for sprouts but saying that they cannot develop them is to destroy themselves. When they say that their ruler cannot develop them, they are destroying their ruler. If we circle back to that guiding question, where is the way? Then Mencius would say that we should follow our innate moral qualities, which are part and parcel with being a human being. Not to possess them at all would be inhuman. Thus Mencius unsurprisingly recapitulates to Confucius by focusing on Ren Dao, but gives us an answer that sounds somewhat similar to Laozi, in that the current state of disorder is the loss of an original naturalness. While it's certainly possible to rip out these sprouts and ignore virtue, that would be a path of self-destruction. In fact, there is an inherent need to nurture these virtues, just as humans have many physiological and psychological needs. In a way, Mencius is defining humanity by saying like it's part of the definition of being human to have this impulse towards these virtues. And so in the mentioned formulation, We can understand morality then as the fulfillment of a natural craving for goodness. That is his central claim. But this of course raises the question of why evil exists at all. And Mencius's answer reminds me of some of Socrates' remarks in the Republic, about the lovers of sights and sounds as deluded dreamers in comparison to the philosopher who seeks the truth of the forms. When an interlocutor asks Mencius why, if we are all human beings, why do some become great and others become small? Mencius says, well, the great men follow their great qualities, nobler part. And small men follow their small qualities, inferior part. But then his interlocutor persists asking, why do some follow their greater qualities and others do not? Why does that happen? Mencius's answer is, when our senses of sight and hearing are used without thought and are thereby obscured by material things, the material things act in the material senses and lead them astray. That is all. The function of the mind is to think. If we think, we will grasp the principles of things. If we do not think, we will not get them. This is what heaven has given us. If we first build up the nobler part of our nature, then the inferior part cannot overcome it. It is simply this that makes a man great. So the lovers of sights and sounds who follow after the objects of their desire, objects taken in by the senses and do so without thinking, are essentially corrupted. So again we have a striking parallel to Platonism. Essentially it is with our faculty of the intellect that makes us truly human, right? Because with that faculty we can come to understand that virtue is a way of sort of elevating ourselves above being simply prey to our materialistic desires. There's another passage where Mencius says in so many words, yes, I love life, but I love virtue, righteousness, even more. Yes, I hate and fear death, but I hate and fear vice even more. This is sacrificing one's life for righteousness. The evaluation that's being made here is that one's character is worth more than the hope for profit or risk of loss, or even the risk of one's life. It is through thinking, through learning and instruction, that we can come to know that virtue is more valuable than any material things. This is why instruction is required for the nurturing of virtue, just as water and sunshine are required for the nurturing of a plant. It is of the nature of the plant to grow, to flourish, to do all these things. And yet there are all these ways that we could disrupt that process, fail to safeguard the plant that we're trying to grow, or fail to nurture it properly. And this is sort of the analogy to the sprouts of goodness within us, and why we can be innately good and at the same time require moral instruction. Thus Mencius has this to say of the Tao: humanity is man's mind and righteousness is man's Tao path. Pity the man who abandons the Tao and does not follow it, and who has lost his heart and does not know how to recover it. When people's dogs and fowls are lost, they go to look for them, and yet when they have lost their hearts, they do not go to look for them. The way of learning, the Tao of learning, is none other than finding the lost mind. Heart and mind are indicated by the same word in Chinese Xin, which has both meanings. So that's why at first the translator has him talking about finding a lost heart and then about finding the lost mind. It's really fundamentally the same thing. So it's the familiar story. We've lost the Tao. And this is the matter of greatest importance. Mencius has a similar conception of the Tao as Confucius, and elaborates that learning is the recovery of our lost humanity. But he gives an image of the way's destination as an original naturalness. That sort of naturally sprouts upward, rather than a top-down directive from, say, heaven. Although you know that comes with the caveat that these are gifts that heaven has given us, man's natural virtue. Before we move on, I want to note that we know basically nothing about Mencius as a person. We know he was a professional teacher. We know roughly the dates during which he lived, sometime in the 4th century BC. We know he was an opponent of the Mohists and the followers of Xunzi. The Mohists were a school that was somewhat pragmatic. They believed in achieving the common good through impartial decision-making. They stressed frugality and thought that ceremonies and music were wasteful. Xunzi, meanwhile, was an individualist, I suppose you could say, who basically said that life is short and you should just live for yourself and your own happiness. It should be obvious from Mencius's doctrines that he was staunchly opposed to these positions. But other than these bare facts, there are few certain details of his life. He mostly survives through his work. But his work is so remarkable in many aspects. Of all the philosophers of this period, no one gives more care or attention to the welfare of the people, the general populace. And no one reaches quite the same level of idealism regards the human condition as Mencius does. And I mean idealism here in both the philosophical and the colloquial sense of the term. After all, they usually accompany one another. Mencius is both optimistic about the human race. But he also holds again the idea, the course of learning and instruction above our material desires. Our final figure for consideration today will be Xunzi, whom Wingsit Chan notes was incredibly influential during the Qin and Han dynasties, which was basically the integrative unified period that followed the Axial Age. But he fell into obscurity afterwards. And that left Mencius to be regarded as the main successor to Confucius for a very long time. Few commentaries were written on him, although in recent years Xunzi has regained some popularity. His dates have him born in 298 BC and living until 238. He was born in Zhao. When he was 50, he journeyed to Qi, a kind of scholarly Mecca at the time. He was warmly received as the most prominent amongst them. He had a short-lived career in government and then spent the rest of his life teaching. First, let's consider his statements on human nature in opposition to Mencius. In chapter 23 of the Xunzi, man's nature is evil. He states his case clearly and unequivocally. This is an abridged excerpt. The nature of man is evil, his goodness is the result of his activity, artificiality. Man's inborn nature is to seek for gain. If this tendency is followed, strife and rapacity result, and deference and compliance disappear. By inborn nature one is envious and hates others. If these tendencies are followed, injury and destruction result. And loyalty and faithfulness disappear. By inborn nature one possesses the desires of ear and eye and likes sound and beauty. If these tendencies are followed, lewdness and licentiousness appear, and the pattern and order of propriety and righteousness disappear. Therefore, to follow man's nature and his feelings will inevitably result in strife and rapacity, combined with rebellion and disorder, and end in violence. Therefore, there must be the civilizing influence of teachers and laws and the guidance of propriety and righteousness. From this point of view, it is clear that the nature of man is evil and that his goodness is the result of activity. Crooked wood must be heated and bent before it becomes straight. Blunt metal must be ground and wetted before it becomes sharp. The sage kings of antiquity, knowing that the nature of man is evil, and that it is unbalanced, off the track, incorrect, rebellious, disorderly, and undisciplined, created the rules of propriety and righteousness and instituted laws and systems, in order to correct man's feelings, transform them, and direct them, so that they all may become disciplined and conform with the Tao. Now people who are influenced by teachers and laws, accumulate literature and knowledge, and follow propriety and righteousness are superior men. Whereas those who give rein to their feelings, enjoy indulgence, and violate propriety and righteousness are inferior men. So this passage includes most of the major concepts that we've been discussing, that the philosophers of the Axial Age have been concerned with. We have a narrative about the sage kings of antiquity, those who showed man the Tao in former times. According to Xunzi, we have a new narrative. They did this by instituting laws and systems. We have a narrative about the loss of the Tao. Why that occurred? Men abandoned the moral code on which these laws and systems were based. Why did they do that? Because of their natural inclinations to evil. Mencius sees the sprouts of goodness in man. Xunzi sees the sprouts of vice. But he's not like, for example, Thrasymachus, who thinks that men are naturally bad and therefore that's just what it's like, that's what people are. Xunzi says they're naturally bad but they can be made good. In fact, they have to be made good. Goodness has to be taught to them, because otherwise their impulses will lead them to disorder. Mencius uses natural metaphors of the flowing stream or growing trees. Xunzi prefers the metaphors of shaping the wood, tempering the blade. So in viewing learning as the solution, he is very much like Confucius. But he doesn't think that this satisfies a natural craving for virtue. That's not an accurate description of the way of mankind. The way of mankind, if it were to be followed just naturally, if left alone, the natural way of mankind would lead us to immorality. So why would this be the case? Wouldn't heaven have given mankind a virtuous nature if indeed the Tao of heaven is this moral order? Well, Xunzi also reinterprets the Qian Dao way of heaven and puts forward a view of nature that is almost indifferent. And in that sense his view of nature is not all that different from Laozi. Xunzi writes, "Heaven operates with constant regularity. It does not exist for the sake of the sage Emperor Yao, nor does it cease to exist because of the wicked King Jie. Respond to it with peace and order, and good fortune will result. Respond to it with disorder, and disaster will follow. If the foundations of living, i.e., agriculture, are strengthened and are economically used, then nature cannot bring impoverishment. If people's nourishment is sufficient and their labor in keeping with the seasons, then nature cannot inflict sickness. If the Tao is cultivated without deviation, then heaven cannot cause misfortune. Therefore flood and drought cannot cause a famine, extreme cold or heat cannot cause illness, and evil spiritual beings cannot cause misfortune. But if the foundations of living are neglected or used extravagantly, then heaven cannot make the country rich. This is how the Tao works. One who understands the distinctive functions of heaven and man may be called a perfect man. To accomplish without any action and to obtain without effort. This is what is meant by the office of heaven. This being the case, although the way of heaven is deep, the perfect man does not deliberate over it. Although it is great, he does not devote any effort to it. And though it is refined, he does not scrutinize it. This is what is meant by not competing with heaven. Heaven has its seasons, earth has its wealth, and man has his government. This is how they are able to form a triad. To neglect man's part in the triad and put one's hope in those with which he forms a triad is indeed a mistake. So heaven, earth, and man make this three-part structure. And man has to hold up his end of things. If that makes sense. He has to be responsible for his own sphere of affairs. Not look to heaven or earth to take care of it for him. Nor try and spend too much time scrutinizing or deliberating over the way of heaven. Spending his intellectual energy trying to comprehend the deep and mysterious affairs of things that are beyond his control or understanding or perception. But above all, the success or failure of mankind is due to his own efforts. His own prudence in ordering his affairs. With the knowledge that nature doesn't change to become more or less forgiving depending on whether there is a good king or a bad king. Whether virtue or vice rule in the kingdom. What matters is how we respond to the demands or to the necessities of nature. Xunzi says later in the passage, "The way of heaven is deep and obscure. The perfect man doesn't expend his energy trying to know the way of heaven." By turns he echoes Laozi and Confucius. The eternal Tao is ineffable after all. But also one should concern himself with his own Tao, the Tao of human beings. He should hold up his part of the triad. What is clear is that just as man's feelings have to be perfected, nature must be mastered. At least to the extent that the foundations of life, agriculture, man's reaping and sowing, the source of man's nourishment, that has to be actively managed. So man is evil by nature, his goodness is the result of activity. Nature itself is indifferent, can impose all sorts of harsh realities on man. Man's flourishing within nature is also the result of activity. Things don't happen by themselves. Imagine this, friends, let's make a bold assumption. Imagine you are a peasant living over 2,000 years ago. A great drought hits, crops wither, and the earth cracks. According to tradition, what would you do? You would kneel before the altar, offer your best livestock, strike the bronze vessels, and pray for heaven to open its eyes, begging that old Lord of heaven, who has will and feelings, to send down sweet rain because of your piety. You believe that heaven is punishing you because humans did something wrong. But what if, at this moment, a man walks up, looks coldly at the sky, and says, "Stop kneeling. The old Lord of heaven doesn't care about you at all. Whether it rains or not has not a dime's worth of relation to whether you are kind or pious. Instead of begging here, you'd better go dig canals and divert water. You'd better go govern it, utilize it. At this moment, does it feel a bit like the cold severity of modern science? This is not just the disenchantment of mythology, this is simply a daring declaration of the human spirit. This is the strongest voice emitted in that era by our final protagonist today, Xunzi. As Xunzi says later in that same chapter, heaven does not give up the winter because people dislike cold. Now all of this may seem rather obvious to those of us who possess what you would say like a scientific realist understanding of nature. But this is fairly radical given how the mandate of heaven was thought to have worked. Xunzi encourages the ruler who understands the interrelation between the way of man and the way of nature to master nature appropriately. And he has some lines about this. And keep in mind as we read through this that heaven and nature again use the same term. Instead of regarding heaven as great and admiring it, why not foster it as a thing and regulate it? Instead of obeying heaven and singing praise to it, why not control the mandate of heaven and use it? Instead of looking on the seasons and waiting for them, why not respond to them and make use of them? Instead of letting things multiply by themselves, why not exercise your ability to transform and increase them? Instead of thinking about things as things, why not attend to them so that you won't lose them? Instead of admiring how things came into being, why not do something to bring them to full development? In words such as these, we have an underlying sentiment that would also appear in the West at the birth of the scientific enlightenment. In the writings of Francis Bacon, it is the task of learning to give man a knowledge of nature so that he can compel nature to serve his needs. Even though the logic of how Xunzi arrives here can be understood through the philosophical dialogue he is engaged in with his predecessors, it is striking to take a step back at this point and consider how far removed is the view of heaven articulated by Xunzi from the view of heaven that we find on those bronze inscriptions from the time of the Western Jew. It is a very shocking thing. The very fact that we could justifiably translate heaven in these lines as nature, and that this translation seems perhaps more commensurate not only with our modern understanding of the world but also with the spirit of Xunzi. I think that attests to this vast distance in worldview. Think about it. When the bronze inscriptions in the Western Jew period are talking about the way of heaven and the mandate of heaven, heaven is absolutely the right way to translate that term, that concept. That was a personal God. But by the time we get to Xunzi, he's talking about heaven in an almost fully depersonified, de-deified form. We can't really imagine the Western Jew calling for regulating heaven or trying to control the mandate of heaven. This is new language. This is a new paradigm of thought. And so to Xunzi we ask a final time in this episode. Where is the way? Where is the Tao? Once again he tells us that mankind must be perfected through virtue. But the destination is not a natural goodness. In fact, the way of nature and the way of mankind are distinguished more sharply than they have ever been before. For Xunzi, the way of heaven no longer seems as though it is a thing to emulate. Heaven's Tao rather is incomprehensible, can't be fully understood. It works in spontaneity and in unconsciousness. It brings forth things through non-action. But our concern should be with the human part of the triad. Trying as a human being to bring things forth through non-action would seem to be folly. Ren Dao is now understood as the mastery of Qian Dao rather than the other way around. To the extent that we can understand the rhythms and patterns of nature, we could use this knowledge to produce order. But it is not out of human nature, quote-unquote, that this order is produced. For what is natural in us is precisely what is disorderly. Thus Xunzi is a naturalist. But in the opposite sense that Laozi is a naturalist. Laozi believes in following nature, whereas Xunzi is a naturalist in that he comes close to what we would call today a naturalistic understanding of the physical world. And he certainly doesn't agree with following nature. That again would be folly. It has to be regulated. It has to be mastered. And so with that, I hope I have helped you make sense of the ways in which the term Tao was used philosophically throughout the Axial Age. And I think more importantly, hopefully we've sort of gotten a sense for the associated questions that come along with determining which Tao mankind ought to follow. We have seen how, in this chaotic era, thinkers shifted from initial religious superstition to a focus on human value itself, Confucius, and how it was further sublimated into a cosmic ontology, Laozi, and then, on this basis, split into two diametrically opposed explorations of human nature, Mencius and Xunzi. This is not just knowledge about Chinese history. This is the extreme of the spectrum of thought that humanity can display when facing a crisis of civilization. But, friends, in this great tapestry of thought, there is one very important figure we haven't discussed. And that is Xunzi. The Xunzi is a wondrous book in Chinese philosophy. More than one interpreter has suggested that the Xunzi is comparable to the philosophy of Nietzsche in some important respects. But before we embark on such an effort at comparative philosophy, we're going to spend an entire episode considering Xunzi on his own terms. That will be an even more marvelous spiritual adventure. We will save that for next time. Thank you for listening. I am Raymond Shadow. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll like and subscribe. Thank you again for your support. See you next time.